Back. There's plenty of places to sit. We're glad to have Prisca Barnes here today. She is the founder and CEO of Storytime Village Incorporated, a nonprofit organization with a mission to serve low-income Kansas children and families. Since its beginning in 2009, Storytime Village has worked to help underserved children thrive through partnerships that provide early childhood development and family engagement around reading and access to books. Prisca is especially dedicated to improving the disparities in reading proficiency rates that exist by race and income in Kansas. I'm really anxious to hear about this. This sounds like a really great cause. Thank you very much for being here. Prisca is a passionate advocate for equity in education and literacy, and the author of the Kansas notable book, you see it right up here, People, Pride, and Promise, the story of the Dockum sit-in. Let's give a warm, fresher welcome to Prisca Barnes.
Thank you so much. I am truly excited to be back at Bethel. Back maybe in 2011 or somewhere around that time, I was the executive director of the Kansas African American Museum, and I was right across the way and speaking to an audience about the history of the African American experience in Kansas. So I'm back here now and excited to be in this space, and I learned about the history here. I'm standing where Dr. Martin Luther King stood, so I'm really proud and honored, and I guess you should be too, to know that you have such a great history at your school. So many people wonder, why is this person that leads a children's literacy nonprofit talking about the first successful student-led lunch counter sit-in in Kansas? Well, I served as the youth advisor some years ago of the NAACP Youth Council in Wichita, which is the historic youth council that conducted the 1958 sit-in. And when I served in that capacity, I learned that many of the young people that came into the program didn't know about the history of the organization or the impact that it made on our nation. And then I learned that many of the adults and community members knew little about the Dockum sit-in. So it became a passion of mine to share this story, and I worked through my literacy nonprofit to make it a reality. 2018 was the 60th anniversary of the Dockum sit-in, and through the support of the Humanities Kansas, People, Pride, and Promise was born as a project. It consists of, and you will see some of this throughout the presentation, a documentary. It also was a traveling exhibition. Prior to COVID, we were traveling the nation to some of our area libraries throughout the state, and in 2020, as was stated before, we published our children's book that became a Kansas notable book, and we're traveling now. I'll be traveling the nation actually with the book. We'll be in Denver and DC and New York and Atlanta, all these different places, because we want to share this story. And it's my goal to help make sure that the Dockum sit-in story is heard all across the nation, in not only Wichita, not only here at Bethel College, but throughout our state, our nation, and even abroad. And so it is because I want to share about the participants who stood on courage, persistence, and careful planning to give the civil rights movement one of its greatest weapons in the struggle against equal accommodations. So today, we're going to take a deep dive into the Dockum story. And because I lead a children's literacy nonprofit, I'm going to tell you a story. And it's kind of storybook style, so just join along with me, but you will have some audio and visual to keep you engaged, okay? So let me tell you a story of a people with pride and promise. This is the story of the Dockum sit-in, America's first successful lunch student-led. That means young people your age, lunch counter sit-in, and it is said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And we all know, and if you don't know, hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll know the vital role that imagery played in shaping the racial and social justice movements. An image could declare to the world, it could show the heartbreak. An image could declare to the world the high courts have banned segregation in public schools. I'm losing my notes here. It could also show the heartbreak of a mother whose son was lynched for allegedly whistling at a white woman. An image can display the determination of a woman who dared to challenge the transportation laws in our country. Imagery fueled the civil rights movement. And today, images, they are telling our stories and compelling people to action. But what? What if there were no cameras or no cell phones to capture the story? What if there were no news stations to cover the story on the evening news? What if there was just one small newspaper that took one picture? The story could easily get lost and the contribution could somehow be diminished. If you look at this grainy image here, you'll see some participants sitting at a lunch counter, but this grainy image is the only image that was captured by a local African American newspaper, and it's the only preserved image of the Dockum sit-in. So that is why it is important for us to tell the story and bring new life to the Dockum sit-in and to help you see how a group of young people changed our nation. Now, the 1950s was a time of great conflict. Racism was rampant in many parts of the country, especially in the South. The civil rights movement was exposing the divisions in American society and in the South and throughout the nation. And while there were many significant acts that took place outside of the South, many people are not aware of those acts that took place out of the South, with the exception, many people know, if you were to say what act took place outside of the South, what would you remember back in the 1950s, an act that took place outside of the South that changed our nation? Anyone? Yes. Brown v. versus Board of Education. Everyone knows about the Brown versus Board of Education case, the court case that ruled unanimously that racial segregation of children in public schools nationwide was unconstitutional. However, in 1958, another courageous act took place in the heart of the nation, and that was the Dockum sit-in. So if you look at this image here to my far left, in the white suit, there's Ron Walters. He was the president of the NAACP Youth Council, and next to him was Herbert Wright. He was the national representative from the NAACP, and there's Carol Parks Hahn, she was the vice president, and then Rosie Hughes, she was the youth advisor, and I actually stood in her footsteps as the youth advisor. Nothing would stand in the way of these determined young people. Segregation wouldn't stand in their way, and like many places in the nation, Wichita, Kansas was segregated. Now, throughout the nation, colored-only water fountains and bathrooms were the norm, but in Wichita had its own segregation issues. One being that black children and white children were not allowed to swim in the same pools together. But that would not stop this determined group of young people. The fact that they were attempting to change rules that had never been changed before would not stop them. Fear would not stop them. Threats would not stop them. They were on a mission, and they would not stop until they were successful. I want to show you a quick clip from the documentary that gives you a little bit more insight into this Dockum story. The Dockum Sit-In. On July 19, 1958, a group of Wichita, Kansas NAACP Youth Council members filled the stools at the Dockum Drugstore lunch counter to protest the store's discriminatory practices. A Kansas law created in 1874 prohibited unequal service in public places. However, restaurants in downtown Wichita still did not equally serve black patrons. The Dockum Drugstore was one of the most popular eating establishments downtown. They also had a reputation for discrimination. The Youth Council knew that if change could happen at Dockum, change could happen anywhere. For 3 trying weeks, the students sat with patience, waiting to rightfully be served. Through their unwavering persistence, the Wichita NAACP Youth Council conducted America's first student-led lunch counter sit-in. Their story is one of hope, faith, struggle, and triumph. This is the story of the Dockum Sit-In. We honor these young people because they conducted their courageous struggle against segregation. Those were the words of Dr. Martin Luther King at the 50th anniversary of the National NAACP Convention when he recognized the 1958 Wichita Youth Council for their successful lunch counter sit-in. The Dockum Sit-In, as we've shared before through the documentary clip and as I stated earlier, was America's first successful student-led lunch counter sit-in and was led by the Wichita NAACP Youth Council, a group of mostly high school and college students. And the Wichita Youth Council's bold and courageous acts were a testament to the many children and teenagers and young adults across the nation who participated in meetings and marches as forces of change during the civil rights movement. And when I think of these courageous youth and their fight for equality, there are 4 themes that come to mind: hope, faith, struggle, triumph. We're going to explore these very quickly, and we'll begin with hope. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once stated, "Only in darkness can you see the stars." So I have a question for you, just to think in your head. What does hope look like? Can you describe hope? Not the dictionary definition, but something more tangible. So think in your mind how you would describe hope, and while you're thinking, I'm going to show an image of a young man. If I were to describe hope as a person, I'd say hope looks like a bright and determined college student named Ron Walters. Remember, you saw him in the white suit earlier? Walters was a 20-year-old college student when he organized the Dockum Sit-In in 1958. He was bursting with expectation for change, and while away at Fisk University, a historically black college in Nashville, Tennessee, he was inspired to do something to change the unfair treatment of the people in his own community, and that's what he set out to do in the summer of 1958. Ron was from Wichita, and the way Wichita was described to me in 1958 was that it was an exciting place to be, especially downtown. And there were lots of busy shops and restaurants, and even many African Americans worked downtown. So during Ron's summer break, that is exactly where he chose to work. But working downtown, as you can imagine, did not turn out to be what Ron expected. Blacks were not allowed to sit and eat at lunch counters at restaurants because the seats at the lunch counters were reserved for whites only. Ron and his friends would have to take their food from the back. So it was clear to Ron that if something was going to be done about segregation in Wichita, it had to begin downtown. And what better place to make a big impact than one of the most popular eating establishments in Wichita, the Dockum Drugstore. The Dockum Drugstore was not just popular, it was a part of the national Rexall chain of drugstores and was the largest chain in Kansas. It had one of the worst reputations of discrimination. Ron was certain if change could happen at Dockum, change could happen throughout his community. So I want to give you a little better picture of Ron Walters. The living members of the Dockum sit-in described Mr. Walters as a born leader. They said he even dressed the part, carrying a briefcase and wearing a necktie when he was a young boy, and he was always ready to conduct business. So it wasn't a surprise when he took on the role as president of the Youth Council for the Wichita NAACP, and his cousin, Carol Parks, which you saw with the flowered dress on in that first image, she joined him as vice president. Carol's family would host many of the prominent civil rights leaders in their Wichita home, including the mother of Emmett Till, the young boy who was lynched in Mississippi and sparked nationwide outrage. The two cousins proposed to the Youth Council their idea to host a sit-in at the Dockum Drugstore. And it didn't take much convincing because many of the youth in the council, they had already participated in protests of stores and restaurants that did not provide equal service to people of color. And they were fed up and they were ready to be treated fairly. So they took action. They were ready to take action. Dockum sit-in participant Galen VC explains in this video clip.
Boys and girls.
Good afternoon, Mr. VC.
We had no idea, some in high school, some in college, that the effort that we undertook was going to be so successful.
Were you scared?
You know, that's a good question. Some things had happened in the nation. In 1955, there was a young black male named Emmett Till who had gone from Chicago to Mississippi to visit his relatives. And he had a lot of cousins there, and he wanted to show them how much he was not afraid, he was a man. Emmett may have made a mistake, though, and that cost him his life. He was accused of whistling at the white store on his wife. He was really killed very cruelly. You wouldn't have been able to known who he was by virtue of the way his face looked. And his mother wanted him to be left that way when he was put in the casket because she wanted the world to know what Ugly had done to her son.
Why did you want to go to the downtown drugstore?
Good question. Dockum's was part of a chain. For the most part, blacks were not welcome in eating places unless they carried their food out. You know, it took over a year for our planning, and we did some rehearsal so we'd know what to expect. And we had a little fun with that, but we were treating each other cruel because we had a feeling that that's what we were going to have to expect, that they weren't going to roll out a carpet and say, you black folks are welcome. One of the things that the adults in the NAACP wanted to do with black children, primarily in Wichita, was to come up with an activity whereby we were striving for some level of justice that we weren't able to appreciate and to experience at that time. Example, blacks, for the most part, could not sit down at the lunch counters and eat.
All throughout the 50s, the civil rights movement was building momentum. and the Wichita Youth Council was compelled to join young people across the nation that were making bold and courageous stands against inequality. And like Dr. Vesey stated, they were fueled by Emmett Till's lynching and the Montgomery bus boycott that occurred just a few short years earlier. They were also inspired by the courage of the Little Rock Nine, a group of students who desegregated the Little Rock High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was clear that the young people of the civil rights movement wanted change, and they even would face violence, in some cases jail, to get it. Many children, teenagers, and young adults across the nation were doing their part to end unfair practices. And fighting for racial equality was nothing new to blacks in Wichita, especially to Chester I. Lewis, a well-known lawyer in the community. In the 1950s, Wichita was considered one of the most segregated communities in the state of Kansas. Lewis, president of the adult branch of the Wichita NAACP, and was known for fighting against discriminatory practices in the city. I was told that Chester I. Lewis was proud. He was strong, and he was not afraid to fight for what was right. I was told that when Chester set out to make change, let me tell you, change happened. They said when blacks could not swim in whites-only pools, Chester changed that. When aircraft companies in town were segregated, Chester changed that. And his determination inspired the Youth Council, and he gave them his blessing to move forward in the sit-in. Chester mentored the youth and gave them hope, which was our first theme, that they could be successful in their sit-in. The Dockum sit-in story is a story of hope, but it is also a story of faith. Scripture says that faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. The NAACP Youth Council was stepping out on faith that they were going to see a change that no one in their community had ever seen before. And with the help of their youth advisor, Rosie Hughes, the Youth Council began preparing for the sit-in in the spring of 1958. They spent months preparing and training. The students trained and they role-played in the basement of St. Peter Claver Church. And Ron Walters was convinced that their work in the church basement would help them to prepare for the unknown while sitting on the stools at the lunch counter. What would they encounter? They soon would find out. The sit-in officially began at 10 a.m. on July 19, 1958. And the students took turns filling the lunch counter stools just as they expected. They were refused service. However, the youth were determined, and they intended to stay at their post until they were served. But the manager was not pleased and would rather close the lunch counter fountain than serve the black students. A sign was placed on the counter stating, "This fountain temporarily closed." And that brings us to our next theme, struggle. The great abolitionist leader, Frederick Douglass, stated, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." So 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks the students sat with patience, waiting to rightfully be served. And for those nearly 3 weeks, the Youth Council endured threats and scare tactics and continued denial of service at the Dockum Drugstore. And one day in particular, during their sit-in, while the Youth Council were sitting at the lunch counter, a small group of white youth came to the store to start a fight and to disrupt the sit-in. Now, the police were quickly called and the gang left, but just 2 days later, a larger gang came back. This time, however, when the police were called, they refused to step in and help the Youth Council. So Ron hopped up, jumped to the phone to call Chester Lewis. Remember, I said Chester wasn't afraid to fight for what was right? Chester called on a group of neighborhood boys, and they came by the carloads, and they stood across the street just to scare off the bullies. And they did that. The bullies ran off. But the incident shook up the youth council, who were starting to get weary, seeing no progress in the change in the policies at the Dockum Drugstore. The sit-in participants may have been getting weary, but they did not realize that our next theme of triumph was on the way. I love this quote from Ghanaian author Leila Gifty Akita. It says, "If you stay determined, the obstacles cannot stop your progress. You will triumph over every mountain." Now, I'm the daughter of a pastor, and I'm rooted and grounded in the church, the traditions of the church. So I could just imagine with my PK mind, the preacher's kid brain that I have, of this Sunday in 1958 in Wichita. Now, Sundays were described to me back in 1958 to be a very special place where ladies wore their lovely hats and the gentlemen wore their finest suits and picked out their finest neckties. And I could just imagine on this Sunday in 1958, Ron Walters picking out his best suit and his finest necktie because Chester Lewis had called a mass community meeting at New Hope Baptist Church, and everyone was going to be there to support and encourage the Dockum sit-in participants. Dr. Martin Luther King always recognized the power of music as an instrument of change. And I am sure that this Sunday there were songs being sung to encourage the youth. Songs like, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round, ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land." The next day, August 11th, 1958, with a new freedom-fighting, protesting courage, one by one, the youth began filling the lunch counter stools at the Dockum Drugstore, and suddenly, the door to the Dockum Drugstore opened, and standing in the doorway with the sun to his back was Mr. Dockum himself, the store's owner. He walked in the store and stated these words, "Serve them, I'm losing too much money." Those words ended the sit-in. The lunch counter at the Dockum Drugstore was no longer whites only and now open to everyone in Kansas, and eventually all Rexall stores in cities all across the nation, large and small. And today, all of these years after the Dockum sit-in, you can still see the impact the sit-in has made. Youth are still making their voices heard in contemporary nonviolent protests that are making history. I have one last clip for you before we get to questions.
What I think young people can learn from the 1958 NAACP Youth Council is that it really takes courage to do the right thing. It takes courage to speak up when you see an injustice taking place. And what they can learn is that we want them to be empowered to do the right thing anytime they see injustice anywhere.
Understanding that just them doing a simply sitting in there and hoping for the best actually changed everything.
As quietly as we began, after 3 weeks, 4 weeks, it was over.
We're talking about a dozen, 2 dozen people over the course of the couple days, right? And yet managed to transform not just that one little business, not just the block around it, but the entire city and the entire country, inspiring the sort of later actions that happen in other parts of the country.
Knowing that you
are a part of this bigger humanity that you can contribute and also you can withdraw from. And so that these children in this climate where sometimes it seems like we're far from it, we know that the triumph is there. We know that we have a past and shoulders to stand where we can lift those babies up and let them peer into the future and see their place and see how they can continue to grow and make a difference.
Today, the youth are at the forefront of the nonviolent civil rights movement.
Show me what democracy looks like!
This is what democracy looks like!
As president of the Wichita NAACP Youth Council, I look up to Ron Walters. He organized the Dockum Sit-In, and that to me means a lot because as the president, I have the role of leadership.
The Dockum Sit-In is a great example of just how powerful these sort of small groups of dedicated people can be.
I mean, if somebody's not going to give you the power to do something, then you just empower yourself. You don't have to sit around and wait for permission. You don't wait on the yes. You don't wait on the no. You don't wait at all. Well, I saw opportunity to really give some people that didn't think they had a voice to get them opportunity to speak out. But around the United States, there was a lot of things that were going on. In Ferguson, you had they were setting the city on fire and things of that nature. I wanted to try to bring some of that here, but just without tearing our city apart, because when you do demonstrations like that, the whole focus is to really build it up. But you saw when they were doing some of those demonstrations that a lot of cities were getting burned down, or neighborhoods, and it was really the neighborhoods of the people that were really trying to say something. They were tearing their own neighborhoods down. So what I wanted to do is try to just bring that here in the fashion that can give us a platform to express ourselves, but just kind of minimize all the damage that was being done to the communities.
Every single successful movement that you see in this country starts that same way, with a couple of usually young people, young people who are grounded in and rooted in the experience of their elders, who advise them and guide them through the process, right? They don't just do this all by themselves. There are usually wise older folks around them to help steer them without taking the leadership away from the young people. Starts with that small group, and then they manage to succeed.
At the end of the day, I'm trying to do the same thing that those people at the Dockum Sit-In were doing, is just say some things that are not easy to say in the way that's not easy to say them. We have to include ourselves, because time after time after time, we're looking at this picture that we know we're supposed to be in, but we can't find ourselves. So now this is our time to put ourselves in the picture, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did, Malcolm X, Huey P. Newton, the Dockum Sit-In. They put themselves in the picture that they know where they're supposed to be in, but they can never find themselves. So I just told everybody, this is our time to put ourselves in the picture.
So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his autobiography that courage is an inner resolution to go forward despite obstacles. And that pretty much sums up the story of the Dockum Sit-In. It is a story of hope, a story of faith, a story of struggle, and a story of triumph. And with courage and endurance, the story inspires us all. So now you know the story of the Dockum Sit-In, the sit-in that took place right here in the heart of the nation. I encourage you to share it with others so that we can continue to inspire generations with a story of a people with pride and promise. The story will no longer be limited to just one grainy image, but together we will continue to tell the story and paint a vivid picture for the entire world to see. Thank you so much for listening. Now we're open for questions.
Questions for Mrs. Barnes? There's a microphone there and a microphone. There was a microphone there. There's one right there.
burning questions. Oh, got a question.
Thank you for coming and speaking to us today. My senior seminar is something that all seniors here at Bethel College have to do. It's a large research project. It was actually about Cooper v. Aaron and the experience of the Little Rock Nine, the Little Rock, Arkansas School District, all that stuff. Could you describe some of the violence that these kids had to go through? Because I think a lot of that kind of stuff now has been whitewashed. Has been washed away. We see what the great things they did, but nobody really wants to talk about all the terrible things that they had to experience.
Yes. So I didn't show all of the videos. I was trying to keep within the time frame. But Dr. Galen Vesey, one of the Dockum sit-in participants, he shared about how they prepared for the sit-in and how they were expecting. They didn't know what to expect, but they knew what they had been seeing all over the nation, and the hoses and the dogs and all of the things. So they did not know what to expect when they were to sit down at this lunch counter. They did not experience the pouring of coffee on their heads like you would see in some of the other sit-ins. They didn't experience the spitting on and all of those things. They experienced things like the gangs coming in and wanting to fight, but there were no physical altercations that took place. They had a shoving match. Dr. Vesey talked about that, and then there was an officer that kind of came and kind of hit his club and like next to them, trying to scare them away. Wichita didn't have, and that was one of the reasons why this story went unheard for so many years. One, because of the imagery, because there was only one image, and two, because it didn't have all of the major incidences that took place in many other communities. And we're grateful that they didn't have to endure the pain that some other young people had to endure throughout the South and being hit like John Lewis with the blood all over his face and all of that. We're grateful they didn't have to experience that, but that was something that was happening all over the nation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for coming and speaking.
Thank you.
Something that the video mentioned a little bit was one of the speakers mentioned the emphasis on community action done by young people but supported by the older people in the community. And one of those things was the help that they had in like preparation. Can you speak a little bit more about like the influence and assistance that young people can get, but still like letting the older people letting the younger people take the lead?
Right. So the way the NAACP is formulated, they have a youth council that is led by the youth. They have their own president, their own council of leaders, and they are to conduct their own work. But they have an advisory board, basically from the adult council, and the goal is to allow young people to lead. Now, nationally, this was the first student-led lunch counter sit-in. And the national NAACP, they were afraid because these young people were taking the lead in something that had never been done before. And so it was a little bit scary for them, but the model is something like you were saying, is something that we can use today, allowing the advice, because you have the council of people that have been through and experienced so much. They can give advice, but you want the young people to take a stand and lead and grow. And then when you really look at how the civil rights movement moved forward, it was young people that were at the forefront of it. And today, if we look at that, if we don't have this big barrier between us and say, oh, they're old, they don't know what they're talking about, or they're too young, they don't know what they're talking about, if we could find a way to bridge the gap, if we could find some trusted advisors and find some young people that are willing to take the lead but also listen at the same time, I think we could see more change happen at a faster rate than if we are in our silos and do things separately. So that was a good observation, but thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you.
have time for one more question. Okay, please join me in giving a grateful round of pressure applause.
Thank you. Thank you, Bethel College.